the question, and Dr. Sean Foley also can see the question. The first question has actually come from Professor Kumar Swami, who is asking about where does the movie and entertainment, industry figures in this changing art scene, and what is the, in terms of role of the opposition from ulama, if there is any, and how does that feature?
Okay.
And what are the issues related to the royal patronage of art and culture, and then perhaps some insights on the role of women. Are there women artists as well, and how do they portray kind of art and their society and their views?
Okay, let me get this. I'm not seeing you. So the first one is, what is the role of the movie industry, right? How are they funded? Was that the question? That was part of it? That was the third?
No, I mean, how the movie industry and how does that feature in this larger art scene which we are talking about?
Okay, yeah, it's there. Okay, movie scene, how it's funded, am I right? That was another, or patronage. And also patronage, and the final one was about women, is that right?
And any opposition from the ulama.
Yeah, sure. Okay, the movie industry it took a little bit to come, but it's actually been, I'm going to actually answer some of those questions from the beginning. Two of those questions. First, the movie industry is emerging as a powerful force. Saudi Arabia has had multiple entries into the Academy Awards in the United States. In fact, some of the earliest directors were women. Some of the earliest movies were women. You can see some of these online. There's a whole series of movies, both movies, I should note, involving actual individuals, like people, but also movies as well. There's a movie just done recently called Muddassir, which is actually a cartoon movie as well. And movies are very much emerging. There's an industry. The Saudi government, as part of Vision 2030, has identified movies as a key industry, has also just reopened, even with COVID, their movie theaters. They see movie theaters and art production as something that needs to be generated and something that their country is capable of doing. And the Saudi artists have produced movies. One of my favorites is Baraka Meets Baraka, which is a movie starring Hisham Faqih, among others, which is a movie which came out in 2016 and was nominated for an Academy Award. So again, that was nominated by Saudi Arabia to enter into the Academy Awards in the United States. And I should note that movie, for instance, there's a powerful scene in the middle of it where there's effectively a dialogue between people in their 20s and people in their 50s about what had happened in Saudi Arabia between 1979, when there was an attack on the Kaaba in Mecca, and afterwards. And what's remarkable about that debate is that Mohammed bin Salman actually referenced that debate in the film. It's at a sort of exchange in a speech that he gave to an international conference in 2017. Sort of remarkable moment to see that. So the film industry is very much alive and well. It's going to take some time, but there's been significant investments that have been made by the Saudi government that are coming. It's very much there. Women artists, again, people who are involved, those directors I mentioned. Arwal Naimi is one of a number of female artists who are there. And women artists have been involved pretty much from the beginning in this process and have been involved all different types of things. The movie Muddassir that I mentioned, the star is effectively a woman as well. So women are very much involved and have brought issues, including as well. If you look at, say, the PowerPoint slide, the fourth slide in, which had the picture of the women you saw the picture with the doves that was there, that was from a female artist as well. They're very much involved in this process. Okay, patronage is a difficult issue and a complicated issue to explain. At the beginning of the process, Prince Faisal provided sort of indirect patronage, but after that initial process, Saudi artists actually up until 2015, 2016, were actually able to get private sources and actively went out and got private sources for that money. Since 2016, since it became clear to the Saudi state that these artists were operating on their own, there's been an attempt to bring Saudi artists into the larger system, to bring them under the umbrella of the state. There's an organization called MEI-S, which is a nonprofit foundation run by the Prince Mohammed bin Salman, that has actually brought in Saudi artists into its umbrella and promoted them. In fact, Saudi artists are now often accompanying when the Saudi state has a diplomatic or a cultural mission, say with the Russians or the Americans or others, Saudi art came with. In fact, when Trump came to visit Saudi Arabia in 2017, he was actually brought to a Saudi art exhibit, which included both men and women. So it's very much into that process. Saudi artists, of course, are aware that there are positives that come with that, but also potential negatives, which is another powerful one as well. Does that answer your question, Kumarasamy?
Yeah, that's your.
Yes.
Okay, I know I've got one here from Dr. Sheenian. Cinema is a growing area in the kingdom, which several directors and producers import on important works. Okay, there are a whole series of them, both men and of women that are there. As I mentioned earlier, Ali Al-Khatami is certainly one. Michelle Al-Jesser are two examples of men who are involved as well. Let me read you a couple of other names here to make sure I'm get here as well. It is early in the morning, so give me a second here. Here to make sure I've got the women here I want to mention. And I should note, by the way, hold on, let me go back here. Oh, hold on here. Get a director here. Okay, it's still early in the morning to make sure I'm getting the name here as well. Okay, Ahad Kamal is another one. One called Sanctity, which is actually up online. A very beautiful film that if you get a chance to do that as well. And Ahad Kamal is Haifa Mansour is another famous director as well. Those are just two examples of directors. And I should know also about these directors, a number of these directors, such as Michelle Al-Jesser, who actually had a piece entered this year in the Sundance Film Festival in the United States, are being trained in the United States. So those are a couple of examples of those names. I can send some more names as well. Does that give you a couple of answers? Actually, Joseph, do you want me to send you some links? Would that help as well?
Yeah, that would perhaps be good. There are a couple of more questions, which I've got in the chat.
Yeah, I want to make sure we've got other questions with that.
We have one very interesting question from Muhyiddin Ahmed, who is a journalist based in New Delhi. And he asked, what about the perceptions from outside? When the more Saudi Arabia tries to open up, the more un-Islamic, quote unquote un-Islamic it is considered by those sitting outside the country. I mean, how does Saudi Arabia or the kingdom, or the monarchy reacts to that? I would also like to add another question of my own. When I was, working on my PhD work, a lot of things, and when I was visiting Saudi Arabia for my field work, one of the things which I noticed is that there is a lot of underground, artist groups. There are lots of music groups underground, because at that time it was not yet, allowed to have, music groups and bands and Western groups, which were actually going outside Saudi Arabia sometimes to participate in these kind of, music, festivals. But within the kingdom, they were doing underground. So how has that, considering the kind of change which is going on, how has that kind of changed in the past few years?
Okay, so the first one is, the first one was sort of how are there outside perceptions to Saudi film?
Yes.
Okay,
so,
outside perceptions.
Overall,
or within the kingdom?
One is the question regarding outside, how the perception about Saudi Arabia opening up the society being so un-Islamic, how is that, viewed outside, and the reaction from inside? Oh,
sure. Okay. When we look at the art thing first, within the kingdom, there's still a debate as to whether this is fully Islamic or not. There are still a significant portion. There's still portions of Saudi society that are not on board with this. That's the first thing. That's the first thing to say. There are still groups within the kingdom, but they're not necessarily the dominant voices they were as well. One of the things that is, I think, most striking about Saudi artists and about Saudi comedians, and Saudi comedians most strongly felt this, but other artists as well, is that one of the things they wanted to do was transcend the cultural barriers between the more what are seen as a more secular and a more religious view, and consciously developed artistic visions that would speak to all of society at once. Remember, I mentioned about contradictions or things that we see as inherently contradictory. They actually pushed to be able to talk to both sides, so that, for instance, at a Quranic recital, you could actually have a stand-up comedy routine. And that the idea that their art would be respectful. If you look, for instance, at the video "No Woman, No Drive," starring Hisham Baqi, you can note they're all wearing sort of full Saudi outfits. They don't have musical accompaniment, for instance. They're only singing. They don't have instruments or other things. And again, they say very consciously at the beginning, we're doing this as a sort of respect the Saudi cultural and values. And there's been one of the things that they were aware of was that an earlier generation of Saudi artists and television were hit very hard by the religious divisions within the society in the 2000s. And those groups had to move, and that forced even some directors to even move to Dubai and to get out of the country. This is their 2000s. And they consciously wished to avoid that. And so part of what they're doing in their religious and other things, and this is, I think, important to realize. This is an important cultural thing to realize. We tend to think of state versus society as a state versus society. So you're in these artists, you have to worry about the state coming down on you like a load of bricks. That's actually not what they're more worried about. What they're more worried about is somebody out in society getting sufficiently angry at them that then the state has to act.
Okay.
In that context. And so that's a sort of powerful thing, a sort of perceptions both inside and outside. Okay, there is a significant anger within the United States, within the Western world towards Saudi Arabia. There is no question about that. There are also those within the Islamic community that are very ambivalent towards Saudi Arabia. That is an issue that has been in the past, that has even got an issue as well. In particular, within the United States, it's become a political domestic issue because of the perceived close connection between the Trump administration and the Saudi government, but also because of what happened with Khashoggi. And in fact, the artists themselves were directly impacted by that. That there were invitations to major cultural institutions like Columbia University in the United States that were pulled back when the Khashoggi murder happened. And that had an enormous impact on the artists of themselves. And there's a significant question about sort of how the country is perceived in the rest of the world. And there are some artists who live outside of the country. Most Saudi artists actually still live within the country, but there are those who live outside of the country who have helped generate this debate as well. And this has created issues. When you talk about, Muddassir, about art, one of the things about underground is that the internet provided a very early space for that to take place. Because the internet wasn't actually integrally regulated. One of the reasons why they set up initial television stations when they set those up at the beginning was that you could do things on the internet you couldn't do on terrestrial television, or you certainly couldn't do on cable television either. The Saudi state has responded to this by trying to bring those people in. If you look, for instance, at major production companies, and this goes back to Quamar Sami's excellent question about patronage, they've done investment, and that investment can be direct state involved, or it can be people acting on behalf of state interest or the royal family. The lines between state and royal interests aren't necessarily as clear as we would like in that context. Right. Sure. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
A few more questions, actually.
Oh yeah, a whole bunch of them. Yeah.
Yes.
So I hope that answers those two questions about that. And again, there was a very powerful industry, including heavy metal art, that connected to different parts of the region. Which you're right to point out that again, heavy metal shows being rated, stories. By that point, those music artists are actually now being taken on and signed by Saudi record labels. And I should note that there's a long tradition within the kingdom of music. Of sort of music and also musical stars. Muhammad Abdu, being which I'm sure Joseph Kashini is aware of, very famous Arabic singer that sang to the entire Arabic world with that as well. Okay, let me get.
Who has served in the MEI for a long time in India? He asked, what is the effect of different regional influence, for example, Hijaz and Najd, on the art culture and art scene in the kingdom? And does this result in a satisfactory synthesis? And then there are a couple of other questions also. I thought.
Oh, I see them as well, and we'll get to Harum as well, and also the issue as well of Israel, which is a very interesting issue.
There's one question which has come to me privately, which maybe you would not be able to say. This is from Dr. Alwait Singh. he asked, there is a constant push from the current dispensation in Saudi Arabia to strengthen the tourism industry.
Yeah, sure.
So how are the conservatives? I mean, this again relates to the same question as to what is the opposition to this opening, the social opening in the kingdom? How is that reacting to these kind of push from the
Oh,
from this?
to give you an idea, how many of you are familiar with the word the Amish? Do people know the Amish? These are people within the United States, came here in the 17th century, 18th century mainly, who still live very what we call 18th century lives. And you still see them. They actually don't use electricity if they don't help it. They don't use cars or other things. And in an interview with a conservative with the Washington Post, he actually used the phrase.
Sean, if I can interrupt, there was one more question which I missed earlier. Maybe I can add,
Yeah.
because we are running out of time as well. There's a question from Ahmed Tashfi on the contemporary Saudi art. How far the minorities in the kingdom, the Shia minorities, how far they are represented in this art scene? If you can add that in the
Sure. Okay. To make a quick question with the Amish, and to give you an idea where some religious conservatives see they are, the religious conservative compared himself to being the Amish. That's the phrase he used. And it should be noted, someone like Mohammed bin Salman is, although promoting what we would see as linking to the West and other types of cultural things, it should be noted that Mohammed bin Salman is himself very pious. Doesn't, for instance, smoke in the way that other members, for instance, of the royal family is. And again, I think there's a broad understanding within the kingdom about issues like tourism and the need to move away from oil production, and that you've got to develop other types of things with it. Okay, I've got about 10 minutes here, so let me answer quickly a couple of these other questions, all good questions. The one about regional ones is an excellent question, because in fact, there had been a feeling, to be blunt, that Saudi cultural production had been focused on the Najd. You look at a show like Tash Matash, for instance, very famous Saudi television show of up until 1980s through the 2000s, sort of was the dominant Nasr al-Qasabi on television. Tash Matash was seen by other people in the kingdom as an overwhelmingly Najdi show, in a way that was very much a Najdi show. And the people, and that it didn't necessarily portray people in, say, the Hijaz in his way that was favorable or even realistic to them. And in fact, part of the anger, Tash Matash was that show I mentioned earlier, the one that drove people out of the kingdom. Part of the point of Saudi artists and the movement that I talk about is to bring in a more culturally diverse agenda. If you look at an organization like Telfas 11 at its heyday, 2013, 2014, 2015, they made a point of telling me that they had people from all over the kingdom. And in fact, that this, for instance, there are different, in the Hijaz and the Najd, there are different types of humor. And I remember talking to a playwright who explained to me, if you're going to give a play, you've got to deliver it in a different context in different parts of the kingdom. One of the things that Saudi arts do, and I love this question, is it shows us how different this kingdom is. It's a vast country. It's like India or the United States or Europe, even like Germany. Huge states that have diversity depending on different parts of the kingdom. And part of what the art allows us to see are those different types of things. A number of the very important cultural people, again, it's important that this artistic movement began in the South. Why? The artistic movement in the South, was outside of sort of the sort of cultural areas, but also the South, places like Asir, had its own artistic tradition. And Quamar Sami's question about women, Ahmed Matar, one of the first artists, the picture I showed you, his mother was a painter. There's a specific style of house painting, of huge houses in the south of the country. And part of Matar's training as an artist came from watching his mother paint these houses, a very specific Assyri tradition. So different regions of the country, and in fact, Garam is from the south and actually began to train other people from the south, Ali al-Khatami being one of the ones. And you can see intellectual linkages based on regions within the artistic movement in itself. And other people as well. Jed has been an important point. Shia have also been involved as well. There have been Shia, both men and women involved in the movement, and also involved in the Eastern Province. Some of the most important artistic traditions have come out of the Eastern process by both Shia and non-Shia, connected remarkably to Aramco as well, as part of that as well. Okay, Ramadan, there was a debate sparked on NBC about Harum. That wasn't the only thing as well. Nasser al-Kasabi also had a debate that was sparked between both an open discussion, actually on a top Saudi television program. And I should back up for a second and explain something. Nasser al-Kasabi has been the most important one of the most important Saudi cultural figures for many, many years. Many years, and he often has his shows will come on different forms during Ramadan. A year ago, for instance, he actually did a very famous show called Al-Asuf that actually looked at Saudi that actually looked back at Saudi history, back to the 70s, and actually showed the storming of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Sort of had that as a powerful moment and talked about the emergence of religious reforms and strong religious movement within the country. And so those always take place during Ramadan. And during Ramadan, these are things that people watch right after sunset, after they've broken the fast. These are hugely things. So he had that on his show. There actually was a debate about whether they should have diplomatic relations with Israel. It's an open debate. Should we just not deal with the Palestinians anymore? It was actually debated live on television. Harum is another special as well, where talks about Jews in Kuwait as well, which was very important as well. And again, this is part of a delicate dance between the Middle East, between Saudi Arabia and Israel, particularly with the changing region, that they share a common adversary in Israel. A feeling also that America is not providing it. But I should say one other thing, and this is extraordinarily important to note. It also reflects the emergence of both China and India in this region. It should come as no surprise when anyone talks to you about Harum that there is one country, and this is from Quamar and Sami, and again, nothing is done alone, that is allowed to fly over Saudi Arabia to get to Israel. That's India. Last year, 1 million people flew on the flight between New Delhi and Tel Aviv. Quamar Sami earlier this year gave a lecture where he told me that the flights were packed with that. And you can see this emergence. Both China as well as India have invested greatly in this Middle East as well. You can see that transition should be noted as well. Israel also plays a key role in Red Sea Indian security, which is emerging as another powerful political issue and military issue as well. Israel is one of a number of navies, along with India and others, that has a presence in the Red Sea as well, and in the Mediterranean. So when we talk about those issues, I should say a plug, actually a piece coming out in the next couple of weeks that will talk about these issues in greater detail, but it also shows that emergence as well. And I should note as well, one other thing, and this is something I talked about in my first book, there were Jewish communities in Saudi Arabia. Najran being an excellent example of, there were Jews in Saudi Arabia up until the mid-1950s. And many of them did not leave initially in 48. In fact, it's sort of remarkable with Najran in the south. If you visit Najran, people will tell you, yeah, we remember that. They'll bring up the Jews in Najran were both silver and goldsmiths as well as gun makers. Interesting position to be in that tribal context. And I should note, Najran is also interesting. It has a large, along with Eastern Province, a large community of Shia. And that Najran, and in Najran, people will remember. They'll actually show it to you, as well. One person told me about being online at a museum in Washington and seeing people talk in both Hebrew and in Arabic. He recognized it was Najrani Arabic. Okay. All righty. During Ramadan, okay, I got the Harum. Are there other topics that are cultural here? Yeah, absolutely. Almost any cultural topic you can imagine is going to end up being discussed. And I should note one other thing about arts as being sort of predicting the future. Nasser al-Kasabi in Taj Mahtaj actually had in the early 2000s actually showing women driving. Almost 10 plus years before the event actually occurred, you saw this on Saudi cultural context. Remember, art is a context where people can imagine things. I've got 3 minutes here. My time is almost up. Let me read this question here.
I think perhaps we can leave it at this perhaps, and we also need to wind up on time.
Okay, let me finish this point about Nasser Al-Qasimi.
Just one more question was there on religious police. Maybe just a minute or so.
Yeah, one thing I should note: Nasser Al-Qasimi produces his work on Saudi. For instance, he's had close relations with the royal family. The previous king, King Abdullah, was called his biggest fan, and he's done his work on SBC, which is a network owned effectively by the Saudi government. 60% of it is owned by the Saudi government. And he's had enormous things. It should be noted, Nasser Al-Qasimi had to leave the kingdom and has still done some filming. In fact, the same series that had the issues that between men and between the conversation about Israel was actually filmed in Dubai. And you could see there was actually sort of scenes that were clearly not set in Riyadh.
Yeah. So I think you have really give us a very fascinating insight into the art scene, the budding art scene, and flourishing art scene in the kingdom. Certainly, you have picked all of our audiences, everyone's interest on knowing more about the art scene in Saudi Arabia, and certainly I hope everyone would be interested in getting hold of your book. I'll now